The small mirror in Abigail Warren's trembling hands revealed what others saw, what her late husband's family couldn't bear to look at. 3 jagged scars ran from her right temple down her cheek, ending at her jawline. The fire that had claimed John and their modest homestead had nearly taken her as well. Now, 6 months later, it had taken everything else. "I'm sorry, Abigail." Her father-in-law, Thomas Warren, stood stiffly by the door of the small back room they'd reluctantly given her. "We've made arrangements. The stage leaves tomorrow at dawn." "Arrangements?" Her voice was barely audible, still raspy from smoke damage. "What arrangements?" Thomas wouldn't meet her eyes. "A man in Arizona territory needs a woman to care for his child. He's paid your passage and other considerations." The truth hit her like a physical blow. "You've sold me? Like cattle?" "We've secured your future." Thomas's wife Martha appeared behind him, her face a mask of practiced piety. "No man around these parts would take you looking as you do. We've done what we could." Abigail's fingers traced the ridged flesh of her scars. Once, she'd been considered a beauty in their small Missouri town. Now, at 24, she was damaged goods, a burden her in-laws had decided to shed. "Who is this man?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "His name is Elijah Gray, Half-Apache, they say, a rancher with a young daughter who needs tending." Martha sniffed disapprovingly. "Beggars can't be choosers, Abigail. Your train ticket and $5 are on the table. Pack only what you can carry." After they left, Abigail sank to her knees beside the narrow bed. She'd already lost everything: her beloved John, their small farm, their dreams of a family. Now she was being traded away to a stranger, a half-Indian man in a territory known for its lawlessness and danger. But as the initial shock ebbed, something else stirred within her. Perhaps this was her chance to escape the pitying glances, the whispers that followed her through town. In Arizona territory, no one would know her story. No one would remember her face before the fire. Dawn broke cold and gray as Abigail boarded the westbound train. Her possessions fit into one small trunk: 2 dresses, John's mother's quilt, a worn Bible, and a daguerreotype of her husband, his handsome face forever frozen in time. "Your ticket, Mom." The conductor glanced at her face, then quickly averted his eyes. Abigail handed it over. "How long to Arizona territory?" "5 days if the weather holds," he replied, still not meeting her gaze. "Changing trains in St. Louis, then again in Santa Fe." As the train pulled away from the station, Abigail didn't look back at the town that had once been her home. Instead, she watched the rolling farmland give way to open country, wondering what kind of man would buy a scarred widow sight unseen, and what kind of life awaited her in the harsh desert lands of the territory. The journey west was a blur of changing landscapes and uncomfortable nights spent trying to sleep upright in crowded train cars. Abigail kept to herself, her shawl pulled up to partially obscure her face. Still, she felt the stares, heard the whispers. By the 5th day, the land had transformed. Gone were the lush forests and farmland, replaced by sweeping vistas of red earth, jagged mountains, and strange cactus formations that reached toward the sky like gnarled hands. The heat was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, dry and relentless. The train wheezed to a stop at a small station that seemed to rise from the desert like a mirage. A weathered sign read, "Copper Springs, Arizona Territory." "Copper Springs," the conductor called. "End of the line." Heart-pounding, Abigail gathered her trunk and stepped down onto the dusty platform. The sun beat down mercilessly. A handful of people milled about, rough-looking men in dust-covered clothes, a few women in practical frontier dress. Her eyes scanned the small crowd, wondering which of these strangers might be Elijah Gray, the man who had purchased her like a mail-order bride. Would he be disappointed when he saw her face? Would he send her back, demand the return of his money? "Mrs. Warren," a deep voice spoke from behind her. Abigail turned slowly, clutching her shawl to her chest. The man who stood before her was tall and broad-shouldered, with skin bronzed by the sun, and black hair that fell to his shoulders. His features were striking, high cheekbones and a straight nose that spoke of his Apache heritage, but with eyes the color of storm clouds. A long scar ran along his forearm, visible where he'd rolled up his sleeve against the heat. "I'm Elijah Gray," he said, his voice even. His eyes met hers directly, taking in her scarred face without flinching. "Welcome to Arizona Territory." The journey to Elijah Gray's ranch was made in near silence. He'd loaded her trunk onto his wagon and helped her climb up beside him, but beyond basic directions and warnings about the rutted road, he offered little conversation. Abigail was grateful for the quiet, for the chance to observe both the man and the unfamiliar landscape. The desert wasn't the barren wasteland she'd imagined. Even in the punishing heat, life flourished. Strange, twisted trees, flowering cacti in brilliant reds and yellows, lizards darting across sun-baked rocks. In the distance, purple mountains rose against a sky so intensely blue it hurt to look at it. "Is it much farther?" she finally asked as the wagon jolted over a particularly rough patch. "Another hour," Elijah replied, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "The ranch is nestled in a valley between those hills. There's a creek that runs year-round. Makes it possible to raise cattle out here." Abigail nodded, studying his profile. He was perhaps 35, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting against the sun. His hands on the reins were calloused, strong. There was nothing soft about this man, and yet there wasn't the cruelty she'd feared either. "Your daughter," she ventured. "How old is she?" Something shifted in his expression, a guardedness giving way to genuine emotion. "Sarah's 4, he said. "Her mother died in childbirth. My housekeeper, Mrs. Diaz, has been caring for her, but she's returning to Mexico to look after her ailing sister. I'm sorry about your wife," Abigail said softly. Elijah's jaw tightened. "She wasn't my wife." Before Abigail could process this, he continued. "Sarah's mother was a woman passing through. She didn't want a child, especially not one with mixed blood. She left her with me the day she was born." The revelation hung between them as the wagon rumbled on. Abigail realized with a start that this man's child was illegitimate, a Half-Apache child born to a white woman who'd abandoned her. In many communities back east, such a child would be ostracized, hidden away like a shameful secret. "Does Sarah know," she asked, "that her mother didn't want her?" His voice was gruff. "No, she believes her mother loved her, but died bringing her into the world. It's a kinder truth." Abigail nodded, understanding the mercy in this lie. "And what does she know about me?" Elijah glanced at her then, his grey eyes measuring. "That you're coming to help care for her and the house, nothing more. Does she know about my face?" His expression didn't change. "I told her you were hurt in a fire. That sometimes people's outsides get marked by the hard things they've lived through." Unexpected tears pricked at Abigail's eyes. It was the most matter-of-fact, unsentimental description of her scars she'd heard, and somehow the most compassionate. When they crested a small rise, Abigail caught her first glimpse of Elijah Gray's ranch. A sturdy 2-story house of adobe and timber stood in a clearing, surrounded by several outbuildings. A corral held horses, and in the distance cattle grazed on what seemed like impossibly green grass. The promised creek glinted in the sunlight, lined with cottonwood trees that provided patches of blessed shade. As they approached, a small figure darted from the house and ran toward the wagon. Sarah Gray had her father's black hair and striking features, but her skin was lighter, her eyes a deep brown. She wore a simple dress and no shoes, looking every bit a child of this wild country. "Papa?" she called, bouncing on her toes as the wagon rolled to a stop. "Is she here? Did you bring her?" Elijah's face transformed as he looked at his daughter, softening in a way Abigail wouldn't have thought possible. He swung down from the wagon and scooped the child up in one fluid motion. "Yes, little one, this is Mrs. Warren. She's come a very long way to be here with us." Sarah peered around her father's shoulder, her eyes wide as they fixed on Abigail's face, on the scars that carved their path down her cheek. Abigail held her breath, waiting for the child's inevitable reaction, fear, revulsion, questions that would cut like knives. Instead, Sarah wriggled down from her father's arms and approached the wagon. "Did it hurt?" she asked simply. "When the fire marked you?" "Sarah," Elijah's tone held warning. "It's all right," Abigail said, finding her voice. She carefully climbed down from the wagon to stand before the child. "Yes, it hurt, but it was a long time ago." Sarah nodded solemnly. "Papa has marks too, on his arm and back, from fighting in the war." She reached up and took Abigail's hand with the natural trust of a child. "I'll show you where your room is. Mrs. Diaz made biscuits before she left, and there's honey from our bees." As Sarah led her toward the house, chattering about bees and the kittens in the barn, Abigail felt Elijah's eyes on her back. When she glanced over her shoulder, he was watching them with an unreadable expression, caution and something else, something that might have been hope. The house was surprisingly comfortable inside with solid furniture, colorful woven rugs, and windows positioned to catch the desert breezes. Sarah proudly showed her to a bedroom on the second floor, a clean, simple space with a proper bed, washstand, and chest of drawers. A small window overlooked the creek and the mountains beyond. "Papa built this house himself," Sarah informed her. "He says a good house keeps the heat out in summer and in during winter." Abigail ran her hand over the smooth wooden bedpost. "Your papa is very skilled. Mrs. Diaz says he works too hard." Sarah plopped onto the edge of the bed. "Will you tell me stories sometimes? Mrs. Diaz told me stories about Mexico, but she's gone now." "I could tell you stories," Abigail said carefully. "What kind do you like?" "Ones with brave people," the child said immediately, "and animals, and happy endings." Later, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Abigail stood on the small back porch, watching the desert transform in the golden light. The air smelled of sage and dust and the beans simmering on the stove, her first attempt at cooking in this new place. She heard Elijah's footsteps before she saw him, steady and deliberate. "Sarah's taken to you," he said, coming to stand beside her at the porch rail. "She's a remarkable child," Abigail replied. "Very direct." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Apache children are taught to speak truth and ask honest questions. She gets that from my mother's people, even if she's never lived among them." Abigail gathered her courage. "Mr. Gray, I think we should speak plainly about our arrangement. My in-laws, they said you paid for my passage, that you needed someone to care for Sarah." Elijah's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened where he gripped the porch rail. "Is that all they told you?" "They implied. That is, I understood." She took a deep breath. "Did you purchase me as a bride, Mr. Gray?" His head snapped toward her, genuine shock in his gray eyes. "A bride? No, Mrs. Warren, I hired you as Sarah's caretaker and housekeeper. I paid for your passage and sent 3 months' wages in advance." His expression darkened. "If your in-laws represented it otherwise or kept any of that money from you, they deceived us both." Relief and something like disappointment flooded through her. "I see," she said softly. "Then our arrangement is strictly one of employment." Elijah studied her face for a long moment. "For now, yes, I won't lie to you, Mrs. Warren. Finding a woman willing to come to this territory is difficult enough. Finding one who would accept a half-breed rancher and his illegitimate daughter." He shook his head. "I'm grateful for your presence here, whatever circumstances brought you." As the desert sky blazed with the last light of day, Abigail realized she was grateful too. Grateful not to be a bride purchased sight unseen, but also grateful to be here, in this strange, beautiful place, with a child who didn't flinch at her scars, and a man who spoke to her as if she were whole. Summer gave way to autumn, and Abigail found herself settling into life at the Gray Ranch with surprising ease. The work was hard but satisfying. Cooking, cleaning, tending the small kitchen garden, and most importantly, caring for Sarah. The child was bright and curious, full of questions about the world beyond the desert and eager to teach Abigail the things she knew, the names of desert plants, how to listen for rattlesnakes, which clouds meant rain was coming. Elijah remained something of a mystery. He worked from dawn until dusk, tending cattle, repairing fences, trading in the small settlement of Copper Springs. At meals he was polite but reserved, though he would occasionally soften when Sarah convinced him to tell stories of his mother's people or his time scouting for the Union Army during the war. With Abigail he maintained a careful distance, as if uncertain how to behave around her. Yet she sometimes caught him watching her, when she read to Sarah on the porch, when she hung laundry in the yard, with her sleeves rolled up against the heat, when she finally laughed aloud at one of Sarah's childish jokes. On a crisp October morning, Abigail was kneading bread dough when Sarah burst through the kitchen door, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mrs. Warren, Papa says I can go with him to check the north pasture if you'll come too. He says there are new calves and maybe we'll see deer." Abigail wiped flour from her hands. "Did he now? And what about this bread I'm making?" "It can rise while we're gone," Sarah said, with the practicality of a child raised on a working ranch. "Please? Papa almost never lets me go to the north pasture. He says it's too far." Elijah appeared in the doorway behind his daughter, hat in hand. "Only if Mrs. Warren is willing. It's a fair ride and we'd be gone most of the day." There was something in his expression, an invitation of sorts, a test perhaps, that made Abigail's pulse quicken. "I haven't been on a horse in years," she admitted. "Old Daisy is gentle as they come," he said, "and we'd take it slow." An hour later, Abigail found herself on horseback for the first time since before her marriage, following Elijah and Sarah along a narrow trail that wound through stands of mesquite and up into rolling hills dotted with juniper. The air was cooler here, scented with pine from the distant mountains. Sarah rode her own small pony with the confidence of a child born to the saddle, chattering the whole way about the wildlife they might see and the adventures they could have. Elijah, mounted on a powerful buckskin gelding, occasionally called back warnings about the trail or pointed out landmarks. When they reached a high meadow ringed by pines, Elijah reined in his horse. "We'll rest here a while," he said, helping Sarah down from her pony. "There's a good view of the North Range from that rise." While Sarah explored the meadow, collecting interesting rocks and feathers, Elijah and Abigail stood side by side at the edge of a small bluff. Below them, the desert stretched out in a patchwork of red earth, green grazing land, and the silver thread of the creek that sustained it all. "It's beautiful," Abigail said softly. "I never imagined the desert could be so alive." Elijah nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Most people see only emptiness when they look at this land. They miss the life, the balance." He glanced at her. "You're adjusting well, better than I expected. Did you think I wouldn't stay?" "Most don't," he said simply. "This country breaks people who aren't suited to it. The heat, the isolation, the hardships. Perhaps I was already broken before I came," she said, her fingers unconsciously rising to her scarred cheek. Elijah's gaze followed the movement. "Is that how you see yourself? Broken?" The directness of the question startled her. "It's how others saw me, after the fire. And your husband." The question was careful, neutral. "John never saw. He died in the fire that did this to me." The pain of saying it aloud was duller now, weathered by time like a stone smoothed by the creek's constant flow. Elijah was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "Loss carves us hollow, makes us into different people than we were before." The simple truth of his words touched something in Abigail. "Yes," she whispered. "That's exactly it." They might have said more, but Sarah called to them excitedly, pointing at a family of deer moving through the trees at the meadow's edge. The moment passed, but something had shifted between them, a recognition perhaps of shared understanding. As they prepared to leave, Elijah frowned at the western sky. Dark clouds were building over the distant mountains, and the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain. "We should head back," he said, lifting Sarah onto her pony. "Storms move fast out here." They'd covered less than half the distance home when the storm overtook them. The first fat drops of rain quickly gave way to a downpour that turned the trail to mud and limited visibility to just a few yards ahead. Lightning split the sky, followed by crashes of thunder that made Abigail's gentle mare dance nervously. "There's a line shack just over that rise," Elijah shouted over the storm, pointing toward a low hill. "We can wait it out there." Soaked and shivering, they finally reached the small cabin Elijah's ranch hands used during calving season. It was a simple one-room structure, with a stone fireplace, a rough table, and a narrow bed pushed against one wall. Elijah quickly built a fire, while Abigail helped Sarah out of her wet clothes and wrapped her in a rough blanket from the bed. Outside, the storm raged, rain lashing against the single window and wind howling around the cabin's corners. "Will the horses be okay?" Sarah asked, huddled by the growing fire. "For they're under the lean-to out back," Elijah assured her, hanging their wet coats near the flames. "They've weathered worse." As warmth slowly returned to the cabin, Abigail became acutely aware of their situation. The three of them stranded together in this tiny space, her dress clinging damply to her body, her hair fallen from its pins. There was an intimacy to it that both unsettled and thrilled her. Elijah seemed to sense her discomfort. "There's coffee and some jerky in that cupboard," he said, nodding toward a small shelf. "Not much of a meal, but it'll do until the storm passes." While Sarah dozed by the fire, wrapped in the blanket, Abigail and Elijah sat at the rough table, steaming cups of coffee warming their hands. Through the window they could see the storm still raging, the sky prematurely dark with heavy clouds. "We might have to stay the night," Elijah said quietly. "These storms sometimes last until morning." Abigail nodded, trying to ignore the flutter of anxiety, or was it anticipation in her stomach. "Sarah can take the bed. We'll manage with the floor." Elijah studied her over the rim of his cup. "You've changed since you arrived," he observed. "The woman who stepped off that train 3 months ago would have been horrified at the thought of spending a night in a line shack." Abigail couldn't help the small smile that curved her lips. Perhaps. Or perhaps that woman was always capable of more than she'd been allowed to believe. Something flashed in his grey eyes. Approval, perhaps, or admiration. My mother used to say that hardship either crushes people or reveals their true strength. And what did it reveal in you? The question slipped out before she could reconsider. Elijah was quiet for so long that Abigail thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. That I would do anything to protect what's mine. That love isn't a weakness, as my father believed. That a man can be both Apache and white, both warrior and rancher, both fierce and gentle. He met her eyes directly. That scars aren't something to hide, but marks of survival. Her breath caught at the intensity in his gaze. Without thinking, she reached up to cover her scarred cheek, an instinctive gesture of self-protection. Elijah's hand moved across the table, his fingers gently circling her wrist. Slowly he drew her hand away from her face. "Don't," he said softly. "Don't hide from me." The moment suspended between them, fragile and charged. Sarah stirred by the fire, murmuring in her sleep, and the spell broke. Elijah released Abigail's wrist and stood, moving to check on his daughter. That night, with Sarah tucked into the narrow bed and the storm still raging outside, Abigail lay wrapped in Elijah's spare coat on the hard floor near the fire. Across the small room, Elijah sat with his back against the wall, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he kept watch over them both. "You should sleep," she whispered. "Soon," he promised, though they both knew he would remain vigilant through the night, a guardian against whatever dangers might threaten his small makeshift family. As Abigail drifted toward sleep, lulled by the rain and the fire's warmth, she realized with startling clarity that she no longer thought of Missouri as home. Home was here now, in this harsh, beautiful desert, in Sarah's trusting smile, in the quiet strength of the man who watched over them in the darkness. The seasons turned, bringing the unexpected chill of a desert winter. Christmas approached, marked by Sarah's growing excitement and Elijah's increased absences as he made mysterious trips to Copper Springs. Abigail found herself preparing for the holiday with a joy she hadn't felt since before the fire, baking John's mother's recipes, fashioning small gifts from materials at hand, even decorating the house with pine boughs and red berries gathered from the hills. A year had passed since she'd stepped off the train into this new life. A year of healing, of finding purpose, of slowly reclaiming parts of herself she'd thought lost forever. Her contract with Elijah had technically ended months ago, but neither of them had mentioned it. She stayed, and he continued to pay her wages, and Sarah continued to flourish under her care. Something else had grown too, something unspoken between her and Elijah. Since that stormy day in the line shack, a new awareness had entered their interactions, his hand lingering when he passed her the coffee pot at breakfast, her heart quickening when their paths crossed in the narrow hallway, the way his eyes sought hers across the room when Sarah said something clever or kind. One evening, a week before Christmas, Abigail sat on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in a woolen shawl and watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. The door opened behind her, and Elijah stepped out, carrying 2 steaming mugs. "You'll catch your death," he said, but there was warmth in his voice as he handed her one of the mugs. The rich smell of chocolate rose with the steam. "It's worth the cold to see the stars like this," she replied, accepting the drink gratefully. "We never saw them so clearly in Missouri. Too many trees, too much fog from the river." Elijah settled beside her on the porch step, close enough that she could feel the heat of him against her side. "Sarah's finally asleep. She wore herself out helping me bring in the tree." Abigail smiled at the thought of the small pine they'd set up in the corner of the sitting room. "She's determined this will be the best Christmas ever." "It will be," Elijah said quietly, "because of you." The simple statement warmed her more than the chocolate. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the moon rise over the distant mountains. "I received a letter today," Elijah finally said, "from back east." Something cold that had nothing to do with the winter night settled in Abigail's stomach. "Oh, from a woman named Clara Langford. She's Sarah's mother." Abigail nearly dropped her mug. "But you said that she left Sarah with me the day she was born." "That's true." His voice was carefully controlled. "What I didn't say was that she writes once a year, usually just to ask if Sarah is still alive, still healthy. She's never shown any interest in seeing her." "Until now," Abigail guessed, her heart constricting. Elijah nodded, his jaw tight. She's married to a wealthy man in Boston. They have no children of their own. Now she says she wants to reclaim her daughter and give her advantages a half-breed rancher never could. The bitterness in his voice was palpable. Abigail instinctively reached for his hand, finding it clenched into a fist on his knee. She can't just take her, she said fiercely. Sarah doesn't even know her. She's the mother, Elijah said, the words seeming to pain him. And I have no legal claim. We were never married. I have no papers proving she gave Sarah to me willingly. But Sarah would be devastated. This is her home. You are her father in every way that matters. Elijah's fingers slowly uncurled, turning to interlace with hers. I would die before I let anyone take her from me, he said, his voice low and dangerous. But I fear this might end badly no matter what I do. In the silvery moonlight, Abigail could see the fear behind his anger, the terror of a father facing the loss of his child. Without thinking, she raised her free hand to his face, turning it toward hers. We won't let that happen, she said firmly. We'll find a way. His grey eyes searched hers, filled with a desperate hope. We, the word hung between them, weighted with meaning. Abigail took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would irrevocably change everything. Elijah, she said softly, using his given name for the first time. I know I came here as Sarah's caretaker, as your employee, but surely you must know that I've come to care for you both as more than that. Something fierce and tender bloomed in his expression. Abigail, he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his mouth to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened with a year's worth of unspoken longing. His hand came up to cradle her face, his thumb brushing across her scarred cheek with reverence rather than revulsion. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since the day you stood on my porch and didn't flinch when Sarah asked about your scars, he confessed. But I never thought you could want a man like me. Abigail's laugh was soft and wondering. And I never thought any man could look at my ruined face with desire rather than pity. Elijah pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, his expression suddenly serious. Marry me, he said, not just to protect Sarah, though God knows that matters. Marry me because I love you, Abigail Warren, because I think you might love me too. Tears blurred her vision, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Yes, she whispered. Yes to all of it. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, with Sarah bouncing on their beds before the sun had fully risen, eager for presents and the special breakfast Abigail had promised. But the greatest gift came after breakfast, when Elijah and Abigail sat Sarah down before the fire to share their news. You're going to be my real mama, Sarah asked, her eyes wide as she looked at Abigail. Forever and ever. If that's what you want, Abigail said carefully. I could never replace your birth mother, but I want it more than anything. Sarah threw herself into Abigail's arms. More than the new saddle Papa got me, more than the doll you made, more than anything. Over the child's head, Abigail met Elijah's gaze, seeing in it the same joy that filled her own heart. They both knew challenges lay ahead. Clara Langford's letter would need to be answered, a wedding arranged, the future secured. But in this moment, in the warmth of the home they'd built together, those concerns seemed distant and manageable. Later, as Sarah napped after the excitement of the morning, Elijah and Abigail stood on the porch, watching a rare desert snowfall dust the landscape with white. His arm was around her waist, holding her close against the cold. I'll write to a lawyer in Santa Fe, he said, about making our family legal in every sense. Adoption papers for Sarah, a marriage certificate for us. Abigail nodded, leaning into his strength. And if Clara Langford comes, then she'll find not a half-breed rancher and his illegitimate daughter, but a family, a husband and wife raising their child together. His voice hardened with determination. No court would take a child from a stable home to give to a mother who abandoned her. No, Abigail agreed. No court with any heart would do such a thing. Elijah turned to her then, framing her face with his hands, his thumbs tracing the path of her scars with tender familiarity. I never told you why I wrote to your in-laws, seeking a caretaker for Sarah. I assumed Mrs. Diaz's departure left you in need. He shook his head. I'd heard about you. From a trader who passed through Copper Springs, he told me about a beautiful widow whose face had been scarred in a fire, whose in-laws treated her like a burden rather than family. His eyes never left hers. He said despite everything that had been taken from her, there was a kindness in her, a strength that her in-laws were too blind to see. Tears filled Abigail's eyes. You sought me out. Specifically. I wrote and offered a position, yes. I never imagined they would make you believe I was purchasing a bride. His expression darkened momentarily, then softened again. But perhaps it was providence, because here you are, about to become my bride after all. Not purchased, she whispered. Chosen, as I choose you. As the snow continued to fall, transforming the harsh desert into something magical and new, Elijah kissed her again. A promise, a beginning, a future neither of them had dared to imagine a year before. Behind them, the house stood warm and welcoming, sheltering the sleeping child who had brought them together and would bind them forever as a family. In the spring, when Clara Langford arrived in her fine Eastern clothes and with her legal papers, she would find not a scarred widow working as a servant, not a half-Apache man raising a child alone, but a family forged in love and sacrifice, a family she had no power to break apart. But that was a battle for another day. Today was for joy, for the miracle of finding love where least expected, for the healing that comes when two wounded souls recognize in each other not brokenness, but beauty. The snow fell, the desert bloomed white, and Abigail Warren, soon to be Abigail Gray, knew at last what it meant to be truly home.